The story you're about to hear is from Melody Grace. If you guys are interested in her stories, check out Mother Ghost's Grimm Volume 1, available now on Amazon, both paperback and Kindle. The year was 2020 MT, according to this record book. Everyone on Mars began to panic as the word got out about the mission to save the human race. Only a select few would be going on the expedition, while the rest would have to stay and suffer the devastation created by their own hands. Over time, as technology began to advance, it's safe to assume pollution advanced with it. I haven't been able to track down the early journals depicting such things, but in the ones that I have, I can tell you that Mars was beautiful before she cried out for help. She was much like Earth is now. Beautiful greenery covered a good portion of the planet, while the bigger portion was littered with oceans as far as the eye could see. Civilization was much like Earth's, always growing, expanding to sizes too great to fully comprehend. Now Mars is dying. We had no one to blame but ourselves. Due to years of pollution, gases began to absorb the infrared radiation that was released, preventing the heat from escaping the planet. In a short time, everyone on Mars would eventually be attending the same barbecue, if you get my drift. It had started out slowly at first, an unusual amount of earthquakes and longer winters. The summers began to reach alarming temperatures, causing vast fire outbreaks across the globe. People also stopped relying on medicine and science, causing diseases that had previously been eradicated to rise from the grave. What began as a gradual progression swiftly turned into worldwide panic as word grew of their mistakes. They needed a solution, and they needed it quickly. So when a small group of scientists came up with a plan to evacuate a total of 20 people. The list consisted of 4 scientists, 5 healthy males along with their mates, and the last 6 were put into a raffle. However, the true panic began when the raffle details were sent out. Only ages 13 through 30 need apply, no previous health conditions. Must undergo an extreme fertility exam. Must be willing to mate with a partner of our choosing. Knowledge of weaponry is not required, but heavily suggested. Can you imagine the outcry? Families turned on each other. Government officials took to bribery, no surprise there. And as an ominous fog covered the planet, streets were littered with garbage, while businesses were ransacked, laws were forgotten, and morals were a joke of the past. Mars was in a blanket of chaos, and there was no way to stop it, no on-off button to try. They were simply doomed. And after reading these transcripts, I'm not sure if it was the greenhouse effect that killed them after all. I'd honestly say the roster did most of that for them. The minds that would establish the fate of the human race sat up in the Tower of Comfort, watching the rest of the world implode on itself. The 2 leading members of the mission were Adam and Eve, both scientists. They're also the council that would oversee the raffle, essentially playing God when it came to which lives to save. Boy, did they love it. The Christian Bible actually originated on Mars. The version that you have on Earth is a very close replica, only it didn't happen on Earth at all. The stories have been changed along the way to fit your greed-enriched agendas. Don't feel bad, though. See, I grew up there, too. Once civilization grasps onto us with the depravity and the hate created by mankind, it's very hard to be Christ-like. Unless you were Adam and Eve. Being religious themselves, they felt they were only doing God's work. They also felt that Mars was deteriorating because God was punishing its inhabitants. It couldn't possibly have been because quite a few people were selfish, garbage humans that only thought about themselves. The mission went as planned, for the most part, that is. On the 10th of April, all 20 passengers boarded the Eden, the spiritual vessel that would take them on their journey. Adam made a big speech filled with lies and broken promises of a better life for all, before closing the hatch. And that's the last actual record of life on Mars. All communication was terminated upon ascension into space, thus creating the sudden halt of history being recorded into the book. So to put it simply, it's because they all died. Once in space, the inhabitants of the Eden began their search for a new home, and luckily for them, Earth was in an orbit that would pass them at just the right point, making their journey roughly 247 days if they used most of their fuel resource, which they would, since they didn't plan on leaving once they arrived. The time aboard the Eden was tougher than they had anticipated. Unexpected pregnancies occurred, which left the crew up for a moral debate. Save the mother or save the baby and risk the possibility of death once they breached the Earth's atmosphere, given they didn't know if the baby's body could sustain such a journey. They always chose the mother. However, this debate would ironically cause the death of one of their own, in a homicide. Roger Douglas and his mate, Irvina Thompson, had gone against protocol and begun their copulation duties early. Around 3 months into her pregnancy, Irvina began to endure extreme complications. The gravity had taken its toll on her fragile frame. After a serious discussion with Roger, Adam and Eve decided it was best for their survival to abort the fetus. They had Roger sign a form giving them permission to proceed with the surgery, despite Irvina's wishes to continue. She was drugged at dinner without her knowledge, and discreetly taken into the infirmary, where the bloodbath would begin. The record states that she was extremely hostile upon waking and trying to stab Eve with a surgical instrument. She was fortunately detained and sedated heavily for the rest of the recovery, approximately 3 days. When she was determined to be of sound mind and body, she was returned to the rest of the crew with little worry. They found Roger's mutilated body in his cabin the next day, Irvina sobbing by his side. Her hands were covered in crimson guilt of her crimes. She confessed to everything, taking a deal of polygamy to stay on the ship instead of being floated. It's tragic. Everyone knew floating was just a spineless threat, used to keep them in line. They couldn't afford to lose another body to space. Still, no one dared question it. The uncertainty of just how far Adam and Eve would go to ensure their own survival was terrifying in itself. After they prepared Roger's body for his starry night, they stood in a small circle and held a funeral. No more tears were shed from Irvina. She stood amongst her crew and glared down at the body of her former mate, with a look of disgust planted heavily upon her face. After the ceremony, she returned to her bunker while the rest of the crew watched with heavy hearts as Roger floated off into the void. Life on the Eden became a life of suspicion after that day. No one on board truly knew one another, apart from Adam and Eve, and it showed greatly in their journals. Instead of the family mentality that was planned, hostility reared an arrogant head in its place. They were all out for number one, and they didn't care who suffered. Survival of the fittest at its finest. The journal entries get a little sporadic around the 200th day. Adam mostly talks about how he feels Eve has grown a fondness towards Lucas Snake, another scientist on board. He even wrote out a very detailed description of what he would do to them both if Eve had an affair. It wasn't pretty. Eve, of course, denied all of Adam's theories of an affair. Her journal, however, stated otherwise. She was in fact growing feelings for Lucas. She was fascinated with his stories of travel and fun, something she had been denied of her whole life. She recalls one night where he met her in a cafeteria and shared a brief, intimate moment, followed by a wave of guilt far too strong to ignore. From there on out, it was always business between them. The planet finally became visible to the crew about 5 days before their estimated time of arrival. The sight was unlike anything they had ever seen before. The glorious round globe beckoned to them in all its beauty, gently reminding them of home. As they reached Earth's atmosphere and transcended through its layers, Snake wrote about the electricity radiating on board. Everyone was both nervous and excited, bodies linked together in anticipation of the unknown. Each jolt from the descent causing their anxiety to skyrocket. The landing wasn't as smooth as they would have liked. Pieces of the Eden had been stripped away, causing some panic amongst the crew. However, Christopher Benoit, one of the pre-selected 10, happened to be a mechanic and a vital asset to the team. His early entries showed little concern for the minor damages. Once the legs of the ship had been anchored, Adam and Eve quickly got to work. They eagerly suited up and instructed the rest of the crew to stay aboard and monitor the surroundings of the cameras. No one complained. They made their way into the airlock, released the pressure, and slowly opened the hatch. ready to take the first steps into uncharted ground. They intertwined their fingers and smiled as the ramp lowered. As they inched towards the first steps, their suits began to buzz with urgency. Snake began pounding on the airlock. Turn back now, he shouted. Adam yanked Eve back, slamming his hand onto the hatch retrieval as he did. Once it was closed and the pressure in the cabin stabilized, Eve yanked off her helmet. The hell? Why did you stop me? Adam ignored her as he made his way back out of the airlock, Snake on his tail. According to his log, the planet was uninhabitable, to humans anyway. It was a great defeat. For days, no one spoke. They all just existed in this fog of impending doom. I found a hidden note in the back of Eve's journal that to some back then would be described as the writings of a deranged woman. She writes about a monster that would pass by the window of her cabin late at night. A beast with a long tail, elongated torso, and a ginormous head filled with razor-sharp teeth. Apparently, its bright amber eyes were what haunted her dreams at night, lurking in the shadows of her subconscious, ready to devour her hopes and dreams. Knowing now what they didn't back then, I can only assume that she was referring to dinosaurs, specifically a Tyrannosaurus Rex. They were actually lucky. All it did was stalk their ship in her dreams, rather than her flesh. Now, the most interesting part in all of these journals is how they came to actually live in this planet. After a brief period of depression, it appears that Gary Hill, the fourth scientist on board, had come up with a plan. See, in his journal, he described the proper levels needed for a person to actively survive the ideal conditions. Like other things in life, breathing isn't as simple as one would assume. What we breathe in is far from pure oxygen. It's essentially a mixture of nitrogen, oxygen, argon, and carbon dioxide, along with some other minor elements. The problem with Earth, when they arrived, was the level of oxygen versus the level of nitrogen. The oxygen level was much too low. Gary described the need to create an algae that had formed on Mars called phytoplankton. Now, if they could find a way to disperse it throughout the planet and raise the oxygen levels, he estimated the conditions would become habitable in less than a year. All he needed to do was find a source of algae on Earth and modify it. The crew had drawn straws to see who would make the journey to the nearest body of water, approximately 20 yards away. Michael Ross, another raffle winner, had chosen the short straw. He describes his journey to retrieve the algae with vivid detail in his journal, with his conscience yelling at him. He made his way to the suit locker, carefully attaching each piece together with the help of Eve. His whole body was trembling as he stepped into the airlock, and after releasing the hatch, he took 2 steps forward and sighed. There goes nothing. He could feel the warm sun through his suit as he reached the outside of the ship. With a newfound confidence, he quickly sprinted to the water, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Once he reached the edge, he immediately began searching for anything, even remotely green. Large shells and rocks were hastily placed in a bucket of hopes of algae being attached, and once it was full, he sprinted back to the ship, his adrenaline finally fading from his body and turning to fear. He made it. Safely inside the airlock, he quickly closed the hatch and released the pressure, trying to fight off the feeling to faint. He was met with enthusiastic claps in the back and hoorays from his team. He glanced over at Gary and winked while he handed him the bucket. This was a great win for everyone on board. Gary quickly set up his station in the back of the ship, working day and night, growing and mutating the algae that thankfully rested upon some of the bigger rocks. About a week passed before he finally found the correct mutation. Once it had reached the prime stage to multiply, he would encapsulate it in the biodegradable pods that could be released. This process took months, and the crew's patience depleted with each passing day. In 4 months' time, his algae was ready. Adam calculated the proper route that would enable them to release the most phytoplankton into the oceans without running out of fuel. They were ready, and they were exhausted. As they started up the Eden, they all huddled in prayer before they set off. If they ran out of fuel along the way, nothing could be done. And hope for the human race would have died along with them. When they reached the first body of water, Gary made his way to the airlock and set up a portion of his pods. Once the pressure had released, he opened up the hatch while he was safely on the other side and sent his phytoplankton down to the Big Blue. This went on for about a week as they traveled to the closest continents they could. After they ran out of pods, they were attempting to make their way back to the landing site when the engines gave out. And now all they could do was wait and pray. Pray that the algae would render the planet habitable within the year. Hopefully before they ran out of their food supply. As the months passed, the crew began to observe a strange phenomena. Creatures resembling the one Eve had witnessed began to litter the ground around them. I found sketches of approximately 30 different species transcribed into Mariah Templeton's journal. She was one of the raffle winners. She'd been a young art teacher back on Mars. Sadly, they would later find out that Gary's phytoplankton, although essential to their own survival, had been toxic to the dinosaurs, thus beginning their eventual extinction. Now, some would survive and evolve, but most of the species would never get that chance. They'd be left for future excavations that would amaze the world. 8 months into the experiment, they decided to test the conditions, and Gary himself was actually the first one to volunteer. He marched his way past the rest of the crew with determination in each of his steps. As he approached the airlock, he waved to them before stepping inside. No thoughts of turning back. Once the pressure had been released, he slammed his fist onto the lever and waited. As the latch opened, he inhaled deeply, letting the new air fill his stagnant lungs. The crew watched in anticipation as he took the first step into the new world. The smells invigorated all of his senses at once as a wide grin spread across his face. He pulled out his sensor to be sure of the quality, and sure enough, the phytoplankton had given Earth the balance it needed. Gary began jumping around frantically, letting the crew know it was safe. They all raced to the hatch, and just like that, humanity would survive. They started out into homes made from caves and makeshift huts. Not particularly annoyed at having to start over. They were just happy to be alive. I assumed all journals concerning the technology of Mars had been destroyed in hopes of a better life. If only they could see us now. If only they knew what the world would once again become. Given what I've told you, I need you to take this warning with great care. These journals, they've been passed down in my family generation after generation, ensuring that the knowledge of what happened to Mars would be preserved. On my father's deathbed, he made me promise to tell everyone before it was too late. History has a lovely way of repeating itself. And if you aren't careful, it might just repeat in death and despair. The time is now. Change must start now. Earth needs you, and she won't ask twice. Hey there kids, it's me, Mrcreepypasta, and welcome to the new decade of 2020, which means that the channel, I think at some point, at some point this month, I believe, this month or next, the channel officially turns 9 years old, which is pretty incredible. It means there's almost been a decade of MCP. So, thank you guys so much for watching or listening. If you're listening to this on the podcast, available on Spotify and on Apple and on SoundCloud and on Google or wherever you get your podcasts from. Or if you're listening on the podcast, then thank you for watching on YouTube and subscribing to Mrcreepypasta. And a very big thank you to my patrons from patreon.com/Mrcreepypasta, such as Dr. Strawberry, Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Chompski, Brianna Van Tine-Janzen, Stephanie VanHuss, Tristain Pelton, G Weevil 3, Diane Kraus, Asia, TheRedOakShieldVirus, Sindee Barney, Nico, kaeo, Kaleb Dougal, Daniel Poulsen, Dante Rowe, The Lastbladesong, TheGingerBroz, Don Meulmeester, Eliminator86, Nebsky, Sky Harbor, Finley, SteampunkSinner, Raphael Rodriguez, and OptimisticAvacado. You guys are the MVPs, and everybody down there in the description, a big thank you to you guys as well. If anyone listening likes warm tea while you listen to scary stories or to help you fall asleep, all of you insomniacs there in the live stream, then I strongly suggest you check out my wife's tea shop at etsy.com/shop/ivorymonocletea. And to follow me more on your phone, you can check out Pop Base. It's a new mobile game, and you can find the link to it in the description down below. Visit my place, do some quizzes of cursed knowledge and the like. Sweet dreams, everybody.